Well, thanks for coming out. You guys are all the conservative base, though. That's obvious. And one of the things we got to do is never lose hope, never lose optimism. A lot of negative stuff here today. We got to talk about that, don't we? I mean, one of the ways to yank ourselves out of complacency is to let ourselves know what's going on in the country and what we got to do to change it. But there are some optimistic things, too, that we want to get to today, because I want to motivate you in ways that you haven't motivated before. One of the things, I see two people standing up here right now. This is not an endorsement of Donald Trump, but one of the things that Donald Trump has done is he's raised to the dialogue a number of issues that are facing everyday Americans, like immigration, illegal aliens, the issue of exporting jobs out. Those are all things that Americans as a whole are 100% on our side, right? The majority of Americans are against illegals being within our borders. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican, Democrat, or in the middle. That's a fact. The majority of Americans, they don't want to see our jobs exported. They want us to make America great. There's no doubt about it. That's what we all want. But there are a lot of these forces, kind of from the top down, that are tamping us down. And we got to ask ourselves why. I mean, why do we have a president, for example, that's out there supporting jihadists overseas? How many people have friends that are in the military or family in the military? Almost all of you. Lots of veterans out there too. You know, I talked to a veteran, this was several months ago, who had been deployed 7-8 times. And he looks back at what he did in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he just shakes his head. It's like, what in the world did we do there? What about all my buddies that got wounded, that got killed? We now have jihadists in control effectively of Iraq. Look at what's going on in Syria, for crying out loud. I mean, you got the Russians putting down, these radical groups that are killing Christians, while our administration is trying to protect them. Look at Libya. It's just an absolute nightmare. It's a disaster. It's another area where Americans are on our side. Now, Islam, this whole political correct movement, it drives me absolute wacko. I mean, you talk to the guy and the gal on the street, and you ask somebody, hey, do you think it's wrong to call people that live in the United States Americans? Well, guess what? At American universities, it's now wrong to call ourselves Americans, because you might offend the people in South America. I mean, that's just one of many things. How about grown men dressed as women using bathrooms that your little girl's in? Where do you think Americans are on that? The vast majority of Americans are on our side. They don't sit back and agree with the establishment. And so you got to ask yourselves, why are we where we're at today? Well, there's a train of thought. It's because we've compromised. We've decided in our voting, you got a Republican, you got a Democrat, you got to vote for that Republican, even if that Republican trashed your candidate, even if that Republican is out there doing something against freedom. You look at what's going on right now in the Congress. This is a good example of the struggle that's ongoing, where you've got Americans thinking one way and political leadership thinking the other. What do you think the support level is for John Boehner right now in the House? Let's just talk about Republicans for starts. Well over 2/3 of Republicans, probably nearing 80 or 90%, don't like Boehner. And yet, guess what? When a leadership vote comes up, how many Republicans vote against him? 25. Now we got what's called the Freedom Caucus. It's about 40 people. They got a lot of Tea Party members that are in there. It's kind of the successor to the Tea Party caucus in the Congress. Guess what they did? They upset the apple cart. And how did they do it? They said no compromise. We're at a point now, folks, where the government, the establishment on both sides of the aisle, I mean, it's very difficult to tell a difference today between a Democrat and a Republican, because they're both growing the federal government. They might have these nuances on the sides. They'll say on the one hand, I'm a Republican, I'm pro-life. But hey, when it comes to defunding Planned Parenthood, that barbaric, murderous group, we don't have time to make the vote count. Yeah, we might try to fool the people and set up a vote that makes it look like we're actually voting to defund. But when it counts, they stop it. I mean, the House, what does the House do? What's its constitutional duty? It's appropriations, right? But what do we let ourselves do? We get snookered into this Republican leadership lie that you got to do whatever the president wants, that the president himself dictates appropriations, and that if you don't do what the president says, well, by golly, you're shutting down government. It's those dirty House Republicans. Forget about that thing, the Constitution. Of course, we don't think much about the Constitution anymore at the ruling class level, do we? I mean, just think about what John Roberts said about Obamacare the other day, a couple of months ago. Remember that decision about whether or not we're going to continue those federal subsidies? And there's this question in the case about what the meaning of these words were. State exchange. And the Supreme Court, under Justice John Roberts' decision, said state exchange means not state exchange, it means state or federal exchange. Now, that might not seem like a real big deal, except for he took words that had clear meaning and said they meant something entirely different. And that kind of violence to the Constitution leads to all sorts of violence in other areas. We're a constitutional republic. Now, we're here talking about Second Amendment. How is that preserved? Well, the Second Amendment and the Constitution. It guarantees our right to bear arms, to possess arms. And we know why, because we're the fourth branch of government. It's to threaten tyranny. We're the checkmate on a tyrannical government because we have the right to defend ourselves. But if we approach the Constitution as being something that means nothing, then it creates all of these other concerns and these violences to our government and the way that we do things, the way that we're led. And it's the reason, again, why we can actually tolerate, why we actually have people that say the House Republicans shut down the government, because we forget all about what the Constitution says, and that is appropriations originate out of the House. Now, I promised you today, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking, except for I want to leave you with motivation and optimism. This country, I mean, the reason that you've got Trump where he's at today is because people are sick and flippin' tired of the establishment and ruling class on both sides of the aisle. This is not a minority position. This is a majority position in this country. The majority of Americans, 63% of Republicans, are sick of the Republican Party. A majority of Democrats are sick of the Democratic Party. They're sick of being ignored. They're sick of saying no more exporting American jobs. They're sick of saying that it's okay to bring in, through H-1 visas, millions of foreign workers where American workers train them for their own replacements. And the Congress says it's okay because we're gonna go ahead and do some sort of welfare job training plan. We'll go ahead and pay the American workers that lost their jobs. Create more more public dependency. It's not what we want. It's not what anybody wants. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. And those numbers are growing. They are not shrinking. The reason they're growing is because you have the establishment that won't back down. Now, remember that Freedom Caucus I was just talking about? Those 40 people that forced Boehner out effectively? Well, now Boehner says he's staying. Why? Well, because the Freedom Caucus actually had success in the fight against McCarthy, who was just another Boehner lookalike. Now they're saying, we'll do Paul Ryan. Well, everybody knows where Paul Ryan's at. He's with the establishment. He's going to do whatever he's told. We've got to push back against that too. And people understand that if we don't continue to push back, if the establishment gets its way, it's going to be more of the same, more deficit spending, more government dependency, and more loss of your rights. I don't know how many of you remember a couple of years ago when I was here, I've said freedom is a zero-sum game. The more that we expand government, as it's been expanded under both Republicans and Democrats, the less freedom you have. And this is the government, it's not just a dependency issue. This is the government with technology that is expanding dramatically in its ability to control and oversee what you do. Most of you heard about the surveillance state. That ain't going away. It's actually getting worse. Government has an incredible opportunity and ability to understand what you're doing, where you're going. We heard about the license plates from David. The reality is, I was in China a couple of years ago. My vehicle got pulled over because of an automatic license plate reader that determined we were in a region where that license plate or that owner of that vehicle was not permitted to be. And that's what they do on a routine basis in a communist country. And we're following in their footsteps. Some would say we're actually beyond what some of these communist countries are already at. That's our future unless we do something to stand up on these encroachments of constitutional liberties. But if you just go along and get along, if we decide that we're just going to give or take whatever we're given in elected leadership, that is an absolute failure of an approach, and it's one that's brought us to the point that we're at today. Again, small numbers out here, but the reality is the public is with us. I mean, you look at what happened with that gun thing in Oregon. That's a great example of how Obama says, I'm going to politicize this tragedy. Said it explicitly. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to try to take guns or restrict guns or do something to limit gun ownership as a result of this, I'm explicitly politicizing the event. He goes to Oregon, what happens? You guys see the protesters out? If you didn't see it, go to restoringliberty.us. We've got the story up there. Picture of people protesting, signs, Obama go home, more guns, less crime. People understand. In fact, gun ownership, September was the #1 month in American history for new gun purchases. Almost 1.8 million. Background checks, 1.79 million. Some people like me go into a gun store. If you're going to go through the check, you might as well buy 4 or 5 of them, right? So it's probably more like 2 million guns. But I can tell you the demand for guns is going up. So if you want to invest in something that's going to have a return, you know the establishment wants to take your guns. You want more guns. You got a little excess cash, that's where the money ought to go. Makes a lot of sense. Plus they're fun to have, fun to shoot, and of course, you're demonstrating your Second Amendment rights. So in any event, I want you to understand, I'm optimistic for the country's future. We've got a very dominant ruling class, an establishment that's used to getting its way. It is terrified of what we the people may do. Absolutely mortified if we actually start acting according to the principles that most Americans hold dear. So that's what I encourage you to do. Don't compromise, buy more guns, and put your faith in God. Thank you very much.